All right, lesson 4-5, completing the square. By the time we are done with this lesson, we should be able to solve a quadratic equation by using the square root property and by completing the square. So to start with, completing the square is a method of solving quadratics by manipulating our equation until one side is a perfect square. And this method will work for any quadratic equation. So when we are using completing the square, what we're trying to do is create a perfect square trinomial. So what I mean by that, if we think back to factoring, let's say we had a quadratic equation that looked like this, where we had x squared plus 6x plus 9, and we were trying to factor that. So we're looking for two numbers that multiply to be the last, add to be the middle. So for this problem, we would have to use positive 3 and positive 3. So since these are exactly the same, that's going to factor into x plus 3 squared. Okay, so that means that it's a perfect square trinomial because we can write it as one term with a squared. So anytime we can write it like this, that means that we are working with a perfect square. And if we have a perfect square, then we can solve by the square root property at the very end of our problem. So when we are completing the square, we're trying to create a quadratic equation so that when we factor it, we get two of the same terms. So like I said, we're going to be manipulating our equations to do this. So when we try to create a perfect square trinomial, we always take half of the middle term and then we square it to get the last number. So half of 6 is 3, and 3 squared is 9. So as another example, let's say I had x squared plus 14x. What number would we need to make our perfect square trinomial? Well, to figure that out, I would just take half of 14. So 14 divided by 2 would give us 7. And then I'm going to square that. So 7 squared is 49. So again, that means when I factor this, this will factor into x plus 7 and x plus 7. So that means that I would have x plus 7 squared. Okay. So to create our perfect square trinomials, we always take half of the middle term and then square that number, and that number will create our perfect square trinomial. Okay. And it will always factor into this form. Okay. So notice that 7 is half of 14. Same thing here, 3 is half of 6. And that sign does stay the same. So let's say if we do another example, I had x squared minus 8x. Okay. So again, what number would I need to make a perfect square trinomial? So again, I'm going to take half of negative 8, and then I'm going to square it. So negative 8 divided by 2 is negative 4, and negative 4 squared will give us 16. So again, when we factor it, since we have to multiply to be positive, add to be negative, this will factor into x minus 4 times x minus 4. And then to simplify, we would have x minus 4 squared. So again, this negative 4 is half of that middle term. Okay? And we keep its sign. So this is a minus sign. So again, we're going to use that idea to solve by completing the square. Also notice that for these problems, our a value is 1. So to complete the square, to use this method, the number in front of the x squared term has to be a 1. So if it's not a 1, then we have an extra step. And we'll go over that type of problem when we start working through some more examples. Okay. All right, so let's do an actual example of solving by completing the square. So again, what we want to do is create a perfect square trinomial. So to do that, we're going to focus on the x squared term and the x term. So here we want to look at the x squared minus 10x. So to start with, I'm actually going to move my 24 over to the other side, and I'm going to leave some space to create my perfect square trinomial. Okay. So we would have x squared minus 10x plus, and then whatever we are going to put there to make our perfect square trinomial, and then equals negative 24, so we have to subtract it across the equal sign. Now remember, we're not allowed to just add in whatever number we feel like to an equation. So if we do that, then we're changing our equation. So if I add in a number on the left side, I have to add that same number to the right side. So whatever number I put here, I also have to put on the other side to keep the equation balanced. Okay? So by doing that, we're not really changing our equation. Again, we're just manipulating it to look how we want so that we can solve it. So really, if I simplify, these two numbers that I'm adding in will cancel each other out. So we'll be back to the same problem. So again, to create my perfect square trinomial, I'm going to take half of negative 10, and then I'm going to square it. So negative 10 divided by 2 squared. Okay. And again, whatever number I put here, I have to put on this side too. So again, we would have negative 10 divided by 2 squared. So let's just work through simplifying. So this would be x squared minus 10x plus, I'm just going to leave my space under there so I know that's the number that I added in. So negative 10 divided by 2 is negative 5, and then negative 5 squared is 25. And we would have that same number on this side. Okay. So now, to solve our problem, since we created our perfect square trinomial, we're going to factor this side. Okay, so again, this side we factor, and then these we are just combining. Okay. So two numbers that multiply to be 25, add to be negative 10, would be x minus 5, x minus 5. So again, we can write that as x minus 5 squared. And then negative 24 plus 25 is a positive 1. So now we're going to use our square root property to finish solving the problem. So I can take the square root of each side, and that's going to get rid of my grouping symbol. So we don't want to FOIL because then we're just going to go back to where we started, and we don't want that. Okay? So when we take the square root and the square term cancel. So now we have x minus 5 equals, and then the square root of 1 is both positive 1 and negative 1. So I'm going to put a little plus minus in front to remind myself of that. So that means that we are really solving two problems. We are solving x minus 5 equals positive 1 and x minus 5 equals negative 1. Okay. So in this one we're going to add the 5. So 1 plus 5 would give us 6. And adding the 5 again, we would have x equals 4. Okay. So those would be my two answers. So if I just write it as 1, we would have x equals 6 and x equals 4. And again, the order that you write them in does not matter. Make sure that you are not putting parentheses around those numbers because it's not a point. It's not one answer. We have two separate answers. So we don't want parentheses. So we want to just split it by a comma. Now, most of the time when we solve by completing the square, we're not going to get nice whole numbers. We're going to get radicals, and we even could get imaginary numbers. So keep that in mind as we work through the next set of example problems.